Emily, you should make a blooper reel.
Okay. Okay, guys. So we are back with our rocky intertidal zone. This is our first video, so bear with me. um, so this is the rocky intertidal, and this photo is actually one I took like 4 days ago, right near my house. And a lot of the photos in here are ones that I have taken recently on my little expeditions out to find you guys some cool things to look at. Um, so rocky intertidal zones is a fancy word for basically like tide pools. Um, and the intertidal zone is where the ocean meets the land, right? And so you can see it a little bit over here to the left, right, where the ocean, and then this is the beach that's usually covered in water depending on the time of day, depending on the tide. So it's an intertidal zone, right? It's in between the tides. This is another visual of that, the high tide line and the low tide line. Everything in between that is the intertidal zone. And there's a lot of changes that happen there because of the tide coming in and out. And there are actually 4 zones or 4 areas in the intertidal zone. The splash zone, which is up at the top. It's not listed on this picture, but you can imagine it right up here. The upper intertidal, right? The middle intertidal and the lower intertidal. And I'm going to talk about each of those further on in this video. So here's just another picture of that. You're seeing the spray zone. This is the high intertidal, mid intertidal, and low intertidal. They say high intertidal and upper intertidal mean the same thing. Again, another visual of this. This is the upper, middle, lower, right? And then it has some other words, the supra, meaning the above tidal zone, the intertidal zone, and the subtidal zone. So I'll post a video later on where you will hear me talk about the subtidal zone, and what I'm really referring to there is the lower intertidal zone. So the first zone is the splash zone, right? And it's up here, and it's called a splash zone, right? Because the only water it gets are from splashes. So during storms where it's really wavy or really, really high tides, like once or twice a year. And there's very little living there, or at least very little aquatic life there. So here's some pictures I took the other day, and you can see the splash zone is where the seaweed ends. Right here, let me get my little screen brush. I hate this thing, but it is helpful. So you're seeing everything above it, right? All this stuff up here is sort of the splash zone. All of this is the splash zone. And right here you can see some of this white, right? That's from leftover salt from the saltwater waves splashing it. It's sort of dried out right there. Okay, so and you can also see the high tide line. So I'm going to draw it in with my screen brush, right? So it's right here, and it's sort of where the seaweed ends. And you can see that the rock goes from dark to light, right? And that's where the high tide reaches. It doesn't go past that. So we call that the high tide line. So now we'll talk about the upper intertidal zone. So this is after the splash zone, and it's sort of where the high tide reaches every day, right? So it's covered with water only during the high tides, right? So it spends like most of its time uncovered, which means that it's mostly things like barnacles. So you can see a couple different examples of upper intertidal life, right? So you see all these barnacles, these little, that's a barnacle too, right? So there's some big barnacles in this area. And some of this, we call this rockweed. It's a type of seaweed, right? We'll talk more about the specific elements of intertidal life. You're gonna see some limpets over here. But you can see it's pretty dry. It's mostly just barnacles, some seaweed, right? We'll do a whole lesson on the different types of things that live in the intertidal zones, but today we're just introducing the zones themselves. Now, the middle intertidal zone has more life than the upper intertidal zone. It's basically just the zone in between the upper and lower, right? And it's exposed, being exposed to air during low tides. So usually twice a day it gets exposed to air. And the other time it's covered with water. So here's some examples of the middle tidal zone, right? So you see this whole thing is a tide pool, and you can see little green anemones in it, some more different types of seaweed. It's covered with water right now. You see barnacles. Over here, this is actually a rock oyster, right? So that's an oyster. You're seeing the seaweed. Again, we'll talk more about these different forms of life, and you can see the anemones up close right here. These are little sea anemones. Again, some more pictures of that. Lots of sea anemones pictured. They are really that bright green. It's kind of weird. Lots of barnacles. And finally, in the lower intertidal zone, it's sort of harder to see because it's only exposed to air at the lowest tide. So you need to sort of wait for really low tides to even see the lower intertidal zone. And this is also the place that contains the highest diversity of life because it's mostly underwater. So it can have lots of fish and crabs and algae and starfish and things like that. So I got a couple photos of it, what I think is the lower intertidal zone. So here we have, you can see just how close it is to the water right here. And you see all these different types of algae. These are baby kelp. And right here, this is lower intertidal. You see this crab right there, right? He was moving around. There is a video that I'll post on the Instagram. And you can see it's pretty much always covered with water and only is uncovered during the really low tides. What else? Oh, we got more. This is just some eelgrass that's also part of the lower intertidal zone. And that sort of wraps it up for today. The main focus of today was just talking about and introducing the new zones. There is a note sheet for you to fill out along with a couple of questions for you to answer. And I will hopefully post some pictures and some video of these tide pools on the Instagram page, which is marinebio_Everett. Okay, so I hope you all are doing well, and I will talk to you soon.